The headlights of Julian's Porsche cut through the midnight fog of his driveway like twin blades, illuminating the iron gates of his estate, a sanctuary he believed was impenetrable. He killed the engine, the silence of the woods pressing in against the glass, and for a moment he simply sat there. He was exhausted, his mind still reeling from a merger that had dissolved into a legal nightmare, and all he wanted was the clinical perfection of his home. He reached for his briefcase, his fingers brushing the fine Italian leather, and stepped out into the humid night air. The gravel hadn't even finished crunching under his shoes when the world tilted. Before he could reach for the door handle, a flash of movement erupted from the shadows beneath the porch. He didn't have time to cry out before a hand encased in a bright, startlingly yellow rubber cleaning glove shot out and clamped over his mouth with bruising force. The scent of bleach and raw panic hit him as he was violently yanked downward. His knees slammed into the stone, the pain radiating up his spine, but the grip on him didn't slacken. He was being dragged, his expensive suit catching on the underside of his own luxury SUV. "Don't breathe," a voice hissed into his ear, trembling yet sharp enough to pierce his confusion. He recognized it instantly. It was Sarah, the maid he usually passed in the hallway without a second glance, the woman he treated more like a piece of furniture than a person. Her eyes, usually lowered in quiet deference, were now wide and filled with a terror that no amount of his money could ever cover. Julian struggled for a second, his dignity flaring even in the dirt, but Sarah's weight pressed him flat against the oil-stained concrete. Her yellow-gloved hand remained a vice over his lips. "Please," she whispered, her breath hot against his cheek, "trust me. Stay quiet. If they find you, we're both dead. Dead." The word felt absurd in the context of his high-tech fortress. He had spent millions on biometric scanners, motion sensors, and a security detail comprised of former Special Forces operators. But as he lay there in the dark, pressed between the cold ground and the heavy metal of his car, the silence of the house began to feel sinister. The security lights weren't on. The usual rhythmic patrol of his guards was absent. Then he heard it, the heavy rhythmic thud of tactical boots approaching from the garage entrance. There were multiple sets of footsteps, confident and synchronized. Julian froze, his heart hammering against the concrete so loudly he feared it would give them away. Through the narrow gap between the bottom of the SUV and the driveway, he saw them, heavy black boots, 3 pairs fanning out with professional precision. These weren't intruders trying to find a way in. These were his own men, the very shield he had built for himself, and they were looking for him with the cold focus of hunters. The sanctuary had become a cage, and the man who thought he owned everything realized, with a jolt of pure ice in his veins, that he was currently nothing more than a target in his own driveway. The scent of motor oil and cold stone filled Julian's nostrils, a sharp contrast to the expensive cologne that usually defined his world. Under the heavy chassis of the SUV, the air was thin and tasted of dust. Sarah's yellow-gloved hand remained pressed against his mouth, her fingers trembling but her grip unyielding. Every muscle in Julian's body screamed for him to move, to demand an explanation, to reclaim the authority that had been stripped from him in a single violent motion. But the sound of the footsteps, heavy, rhythmic, and terrifyingly familiar, kept him pinned to the earth. Sarah leaned in closer, her lips brushing against his ear, so he could catch the ghost of her voice over the hammering of his own heart. "They aren't protecting you, Mr. Cole," she whispered, the words hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "Your security team, they've been waiting for you to come home late. They've been paid to make sure you never walk through that front door again." Julian's eyes widened, reflecting the dark underbelly of the vehicle. He tried to shake his head, to reject the absurdity of it, but Sarah's gaze held him steady. She looked at him with a weary clarity, the look of someone who had spent her life watching the monsters people ignore. "It's Isabella," Sarah continued, and the name of his wife felt like a shard of glass in the quiet air. She's the one who gave them the schedule. She's the one who promised them a cut of the insurance and the offshore accounts. They're not going to kidnap you, Julie. They're going to stage a carjacking. A tragic random act of violence in your own driveway. A cold realization washed over him, more freezing than the midnight fog clinging to the pavement. He thought of the failed merger, the stress he had brought home, and the way Isabella had encouraged him to take this specific trip, whispering about how much he needed the rest. He had built a fortress to keep the world out, but he had locked himself in with the very person who wanted him gone. I heard them, Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. I've been listening for months. People don't notice the maid, Julian. They talk right over me like I'm part of the walls. Isabella didn't think I'd understand what liquidation meant. She didn't think I'd see the burner phone she kept in the laundry room. Outside their cramped sanctuary, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound of the boots. It was the silence of a predator that knows its prey is close, just not exactly where. Julian felt a bead of sweat roll down his forehead, stinging his eye, but he didn't dare blink. He was a man who had built empires on data and logic, yet he was currently being saved by the one data point he had always deemed insignificant, the humanity of the woman whose name he had barely bothered to learn. Stay quiet, Sarah breathed, her yellow glove tightening as the shadows of the guards flickered against the garage floor. The reason they're doing this now is because they think you're alone. They think I left 2 hours ago. If we move, if we make even a sound, they'll finish it right here. Julian lay paralyzed, the gravel biting into his cheek. He was no longer a millionaire, a CEO, or a titan of industry. He was a man in the dirt, finally forced to hear the truth in the whispers he had ignored for far too long. The vibration of the garage floor hummed against Julian's ribs as the footsteps grew louder, moving from the rhythmic march of a patrol to the restless, clicking pace of an executioner. From his position in the dirt, the world was reduced to a narrow 6-inch horizontal sliver of light and shadow. He watched as a pair of heavy tactical boots stopped a mere 2 feet from his face. The leather was polished, reflecting the dim overhead LEDs of the garage boots he had paid for, worn by a man whose salary he provided. Then came the sound that dismantled the remaining fragments of Julian's old life. The clicking of designer heels across the concrete was sharp and melodic, a sound he used to associate with the elegance of his home. Now it sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. The heels stopped beside the tactical boot. He should have been here by now, Isabella's voice rang out, cutting through the stagnant air. There was no trace of the soft, melodic lilt she used when they shared wine on the terrace. Her tone was flat, clinical, and chillingly impatient. Check the GPS on the Porsche again. If he stopped for a drink or took a detour, I want to know exactly where he is. The tracker shows he's on the property, ma'am, one of the guards replied, his voice a deep rumble that Julian recognized as Miller, his head of security. He pulled in 3 minutes ago. The engine should still be warm, but the car is sitting empty in the middle of the driveway. Julian felt Sarah's body go rigid beside him. Her yellow-gloved hand tightened over his mouth, her fingers digging into his skin, as if trying to physically pull his breath back into his lungs. He could see the hem of Isabella's silk dress swaying just above her ankles. She took a step closer to the SUV, the sharp point of her heel grinding into a stray piece of gravel. "Search the perimeter," Isabella commanded, her voice rising with a sharp edge of panic. He couldn't have gone far. "And remember what we discussed. It has to be clean. 3 shots to the chest. No face shots. The insurance company is already looking for reasons to delay the payout on the life policy, and I won't have an unidentified body slowing down the probate. I need him dead, and I need him recognized." Under the car, Julian's eyes burned with a mixture of dust and tears of pure stinging betrayal. He watched his wife's feet pivot as she turned toward the house. She wasn't a grieving spouse or a worried partner. She was a liquidator, overseeing the final closing of an asset. "If that little mouse Sarah is still lurking around, take care of her too," Isabella added casually, as if she were ordering a change in the dinner menu. "She's seen too much lately, and I don't like the way she looks at me. Once Julian is gone, she's a loose end we can't afford." The boots began to move again,
fanning out in a wide circle. One set of footsteps started toward the rear of the SUV. Julian closed his eyes. The cold iron of the car's frame inches above his head, feeling less like a shield and more like the lid of a coffin. He realized then that Sarah wasn't just hiding him. She was standing in the path of the very death warrant he had accidentally signed by being successful, being rich, and being blind. The heavy boots of the security team retreated toward the edge of the driveway, their voices fading into low, distorted murmurs. As they began to sweep the perimeter of the estate, under the SUV, the silence returned, thick and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of the cooling engine blocks above them. Julian felt the pressure of Sarah's yellow glove ease slightly, though she didn't fully remove her hand until the shadow of the last guard merged with the darkness of the tree line. When she finally leaned back, her face was a mask of grim determination, illuminated only by the faint reflected glow of the car's undercarriage. Julian's breath hitched, a ragged sound he couldn't suppress. He looked at Sarah, really looking at her for the first time in the 3 years she had polished his floors and folded his shirts. She wasn't just a maid. She was a ghost who had been haunted by the secrets of his own house. She reached into the deep pocket of her white apron and pulled out a small, cracked smartphone, its screen dimmed to the lowest setting. "I didn't just overhear a conversation, Mr. Cole," she whispered, her voice steadying as she took control of the narrative. "I've been living in the middle of a war for 2 months. I saw the way Mrs. Cole looked at you when you turned your back, not with love, but with a tally of your assets." She tapped the screen with a trembling, yellow-clad finger, and a jagged wave of audio files appeared. "The burner phone she uses. She thinks she's clever hiding it in the ventilation duct of the laundry room, but I'm the one who cleans those ducts. I started recording her calls when I heard her discussing your accidental death while you were supposed to be in Chicago." Julian stared at the phone, as if it were a live grenade. He reached out to touch it, his fingers brushing against the cold rubber of her glove. The reality was a physical weight on his chest. His wife had been orchestrating a cold-blooded liquidation of his life while he was busy trying to save a merger. He was the architect of his own downfall, having built a world where he paid everyone to watch his back. Yet he had been completely blind to the knife already pressed against it. "She's been talking to Miller for weeks," Sarah continued, her eyes locked on the narrow gap of the driveway, watching for the return of the boots. "They have a schedule. They knew your car trouble at the airport wasn't an accident. They've been tracking your phone, Julie. They wanted you trapped here, in the one place you thought you were the king." She handed him the phone, and through the low-quality speakers, he heard Isabella's voice again, sharp, calculated, and devoid of the warmth he had foolishly cherished. She was discussing the unfortunate carjacking and the specific placement of the shots. The recording was damning, a digital confession of a murder in progress. "I grew up in the system, Mr. Cole," Sarah said softly, her voice tinged with a bitterness that made Julian flinch. 14 foster homes. I learned very early that if you want to survive, you have to be invisible. You have to see the things people think nobody sees. You never noticed me, and that was your mistake. But it was her mistake too. She thought I was just a poor black foster kid who wouldn't understand the high-stakes game she was playing. She thought I was a mouse, but even a mouse can record a lion's execution. Julian felt a surge of shame so potent it eclipsed the fear. He had been saved by the very invisibility he had imposed upon her. Sarah hadn't just been cleaning his house. She had been building a digital fortress to replace the physical one that had failed him. She was the only witness to the truth, a silent observer who had spent 60 days documenting his death warrant so she could prevent it from being signed. "I sent it all," Sarah whispered, her eyes flashing with a sudden fierce light. "The recordings, the bank transfers I photographed when she left her laptop open, the photos of the guards meeting with her in the guest house. I sent a package to the FBI 90 minutes ago. I told them there was a murder in progress at the Cole estate. I told them to hurry." The cold concrete was a harsh teacher, and Julian was finally beginning to learn the lessons he had spent a lifetime avoiding. As he lay pressed against the grit of the driveway, the digital evidence on Sarah's phone felt heavier than any gold bar he had ever held. He looked at the young woman beside him, her face partially obscured by the shadow of the SUV's tire, and felt a profound, aching sense of displacement. For 3 years, Sarah had moved through the periphery of his life like a ghost in a black and white uniform. He had viewed her as a utility, a function of his wealth, rather than a person with a history, a heart or a voice. He had paid for her time, but he had never invested a second in her presence. The irony was a bitter pill that tasted of oil and Julian had built a world of high-level connections, rubbing elbows with senators and titans of industry. Yet not a single one of those allies was here in the dirt with him. His elite security team had sold his life for a payday, and the woman he had shared a bed with for 5 years was currently pacing the garage, waiting for the sound of his heart stopping. The only person standing between Julian and a shallow grave was the maid, whose last name he hadn't bothered to learn until she whispered it to him in the dark. He watched the way Sarah's eyes scanned the narrow horizon under the car, her focus absolute, her fear pushed down by a sense of duty he didn't deserve. She was risking everything, her job, her safety, her very life to protect a man who had treated her with nothing more than polite indifference. Julian realized with a stinging clarity that while he had been busy securing his empire, he had completely failed to secure his own humanity. He had mistaken transactional loyalty for the real thing, and in doing so he had become the most vulnerable man on the planet. "Why?" he breathed, the word barely a tremor in the air. I never even asked about your life, Sarah. I didn't see you. Why are you doing this for me?" Sarah didn't look at him at first. Her gaze remained fixed on the shifting shadows of the tactical boots in the distance. When she finally turned her head, her brown eyes were filled with a wisdom that made Julian feel like a child. "Because I've been invisible my whole life, Cole," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of 14 foster homes, and 1,000 rooms where she was never truly seen. "Nobody ever saw me, and nobody ever protected me. But just because the world is blind, doesn't mean I have to be. I saw a man about to be murdered in his own home. I decided that this one time being invisible was going to be my power, not my burden." The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't just the silence of hiding. It was the silence of a man's ego finally crumbling. Julian realized that the price of silence wasn't just the money Sarah had been offered to look the other way. It was the cost of all the years he had spent being silent toward the people who actually mattered. He had spent his life talking to the loud and the powerful, while the person with the most integrity in his world had been quietly polishing his silver and waiting for him to wake up. The stillness of the garage was shattered by the sharp, electronic chirp of a notification. Julian felt his blood turn to ice as he realized the sound had come from his own pocket. A calendar reminder for a midnight board meeting he had forgotten to cancel. Beside him, Sarah's entire body recoiled, her yellow-gloved hand flying back to his mouth with such force his teeth clicked together. The sound was small, a digital pinprick in the silence, but in the cavernous concrete space of the estate, it was a flare launched into a night sky. "Did you hear that?" Miller's voice barked from the other side of the garage, the professional calm of the security lid replaced by a jagged, predatory edge. The heavy thud of tactical boots instantly pivoted. The sound didn't retreat this time. It grew rhythmic and hungry, advancing toward the center of the driveway. Julian squeezed his eyes shut, his heart hammering against the oil-stained pavement with enough force that he felt a vibration in his ear. He reached into his pocket with agonizing slowness, his fingers slick with sweat, and finally managed to silence the device. But the damage was done. The hunters had a scent. "He's here." Isabella's voice rang out, closer now, her designer heels clicking with frantic uneven energy. "I told you he couldn't have just vanished. The gate cameras showed him pull in, and the car is right there. If that phone is ringing, he's within 50 feet of us." Through the narrow gap between the concrete and the SUV's frame, Julian watched the 3 pairs of black boots fan out. They were no longer walking. They were stalking, their movements deliberate and cautious. One set of boots stopped near the front bumper of the Porsche, while another moved toward the vintage Bentley parked in the corner. Miller's boots, however, began to move toward the SUV. "Check under the cars," Miller commanded, his voice vibrating through the very air. Julian was trying not to breathe. "Start with the Mercedes, then the SUV. He's hiding. He's a coward who thinks a little bit of shadow will save him from a bullet." The sound of a body hitting the floor echoed, the dull thud of a man dropping to his knees. Julian watched as a beam of a high-powered tactical flashlight cut through the darkness under the neighboring vehicle. The light danced across the floor, illuminating dust motes and oil patches, moving closer and closer to their own hiding spot. Sarah's grip on Julian's mouth was so tight he could feel the individual ridges of the rubber glove. Her eyes were fixed on the advancing light, her pupils blown wide with the raw instinct of a cornered animal. They were trapped in a world of inches. If Miller or his men lowered their heads just a fraction more, the game would be over. Julian realized then that all his wealth, his influence and his grand towers had been reduced to the space beneath a chassis. He was a man who had spent his life looking down on the world from penthouses. But now, the only thing that mattered was whether the man looking down at the pavement would see the silver of his hair, or the flash of Sarah's yellow gloves. The search had narrowed from an estate to a driveway, and the driveway was shrinking with every heavy approaching step. The silence under the SUV became a physical weight, a pressurized vacuum, where the only sound was the frantic, muffled thud of Julian's pulse. The tactical flashlight from the neighboring car flickered out, plunging the world back into a bruised monochromatic gray. But the reprieve lasted only a heartbeat. The heavy crunch of gravel signaled Miller's arrival at the driver's side door, less than 3 feet from where Julian and Sarah lay pressed into the dirt. Sarah's yellow-gloved hand was a cold, rubberized seal over Julian's mouth, her fingers digging into his jaw with a desperate, silent plea for absolute stillness. Julian watched the heavy black boots of his security shift, the leather creaking as Miller shifted his weight. Then the boots pivoted, the toes pointed directly toward the dark gap beneath the chassis. The world seemed to slow, the frame of the car above them feeling like the descending blade of a guillotine. Slowly, with a deliberate, agonizing lack of haste, the boots began to lower. First, the knees hit the concrete with a dull, sickening thud. Then the hem of the tactical trousers dipped into the frame of Julian's vision. Julian held his breath until his lungs burned, his eyes locked on the space where a face would soon appear. A beam of white light suddenly sliced through the darkness, blindingly bright as it bounced off the oil pan and the silver metallic undercarriage. The light swept in a jagged arc, illuminating Sarah's wide, terrified eyes and the stark, artificial yellow of her cleaning gloves. Then the light stopped. It centered directly on Julian's face, catching the silver of his hair, and the raw, exposed horror in his gaze. Miller's face descended into the gap, his features twisted into a mask of cold, professional triumph. For a second that felt like an eternity. They were eye to eye, the millionaire and the man he had paid to die for him. Miller didn't shout. He didn't call out to the others immediately. He simply stared, a slow, cruel smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, as he reached for the sidearm holstered at his hip. "Found you," he whispered, the words barely audible over the hum of the night, but to Julian they sounded like a death knell. In that sliver of space, the hierarchy of the world was gone. There was only the predator, the prey, and the cold steel of a gun being drawn in the shadows. The metallic slide of Miller's handgun echoed under the chassis, a cold, clinical sound that signaled the end of Julian's life. The barrel leveled toward Julian's chest, the suppressor at its tip, looking like a dark, bottomless void in the glare of the tactical light. Sarah's grip on Julian tightened, her entire body a coiled spring of useless protective instinct. But just as Miller's finger began to squeeze the trigger, the world outside the SUV exploded into a chaotic symphony of violence and light.
The midnight fog was instantly pierced by the strobe-like intensity of red and blue flashes, reflecting off the damp pavement and the polished chrome of the vehicles. A deafening crash reverberated through the garage as the reinforced service gates were rammed open, followed by the percussive roar of flashbangs that sent white-hot light blooming into every corner of the estate. The ground beneath Julian shook with the weight of dozens of boots, not the slow, searching pace of the killers, but the heavy, synchronized thunder of a tactical breach. "Ebi, drop the weapon. Drop it now," the command screamed through the air, amplified by megaphones, and the sheer adrenaline of the agents flooding the space. Miller scrambled backward, his face illuminated by a dozen red laser sights that suddenly painted his chest and forehead like a digital execution shroud. He tried to pivot, his hand still clutched around his sidearm, but the sheer volume of firepower aimed his way turned him into a statue of frozen terror. Beside him, the other two guards were already face down on the concrete, their weapons kicked away as agents in heavy tactical gear swarmed over them with zip ties and knee strikes. Julian watched through the narrow gap as the designer heels of his wife, Isabella, clicked frantically in retreat toward the elevator. She didn't get far. The elevator doors slid open to reveal a second team of agents already in position. Julian heard the sharp metallic click of handcuffs and the heavy muffled grunt of a woman who had finally run out of room to maneuver. "Isabella Cole, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder," a voice boomed, clear and authoritative. The weight of the car above Julian seemed to lift even before the agents reached for him. Sarah slowly pulled her yellow-gloved hand away from his mouth, her breathing coming in jagged, sobbing gasps. As the immediate threat evaporated, the security team Julian had spent millions to build had been dismantled in less than 60 seconds by the evidence gathered by a woman who made minimum wage. As the first agent dropped to his knees to look under the SUV, this time with a badge instead of a silencer, Julian realized that the red and blue lights reflecting in the oil spills were the first honest things he had seen in his own home for years. The heavy weight of the SUV was finally replaced by the open air. As FBI agents guided Julian and Sarah out from the grease-stained shadows, Julian stood on shaky legs, his million-dollar suit ruined, covered in the very dust of the estate he had once viewed as a fortress of his own making. The driveway was a sea of motion. Agents documenting evidence, the rhythmic pulse of sirens, and the cold, clinical efficiency of the law. In the center of the chaos stood Isabella. The woman who had shared his bed and his secrets was now pinned against the hood of a cruiser, her wrists bound in steel. The mascara that had highlighted her eyes earlier that evening was now running down her face, in jagged, black streaks, but it wasn't grief that Julian saw in her expression. It was the raw, ugly fury of a gambler who had lost the final hand. Julian, tell them," she shrieked, her voice cracking as she caught sight of him. "This is a misunderstanding. These men, they forced me. I was trying to protect you." Julian walked toward her, his pace slow and deliberate. For the first time in 5 years, the fog of her beauty and his own ego had cleared, leaving only the sharp, cold reality of the woman she actually was. He looked at her, not with the anger she expected, but with a profound, quiet exhaustion. "I heard you, Isabella," he said, his voice barely a whisper yet carrying over the sirens. "I heard you tell them to hit the chest. I heard you ask for the life insurance payout. I was under the car the whole time." The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin as pale as the silk dress she wore. The lies died in her throat, replaced by a sneer that finally revealed the predator Sarah had seen all along. As the agents ducked her head to push her into the back of the car, Julian turned his back on his old life. He found Sarah standing near an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over her black and white uniform. Her yellow rubber gloves were finally off, tucked into her apron, and she was staring at her hands as if she didn't recognize them. Julian approached her, feeling a strange, humbling nervousness. He realized he didn't even know her last name, a fact that felt like a crime worse than any he had faced tonight. "Sarah," he said softly. She looked up, her eyes wide and weary. "You saved me. You could have run. You could have taken their money. But you stayed in the dirt with me." "I told you, Mr. Cole," she replied, her voice steadying. "I just didn't want to see another person disappear because no one was looking." Julian reached out, taking her hand. "You've spent your life being invisible, Sarah. That ends tonight. You're not going back to that room in the Bronx, and you're never wearing that uniform again, unless you choose to. Tomorrow, we're setting up a trust. Whatever you want to be, a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, your education, your life, it's all covered. Full ride to any university in the world. And it's not a payment, because I can't pay you for a life. It's a debt of honor." Sarah stared at him, the first tears of the night finally spilling over. For the first time in Julian's life,
He wasn't looking at a balance sheet or a business proposal. He was looking at a human being who had seen him when he was at his lowest. And he was finally, truly, seeing her back. The glass walls of the Manhattan penthouse still offered a panoramic view of the skyline, but the atmosphere inside had fundamentally shifted. 6 months ago, this room had been a curated museum of Julian's ego, a place where the air felt as cold as the marble floors. Today the sterile silence was gone, replaced by the low hum of a life lived with intention, rather than just accumulation. Julian stood by the window, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the sunrise. He was still a man of immense means, but the silver in his hair no longer felt like a crown of cold steel. It felt like a mark of survival. He looked down at the desk where a stack of legal documents lay, not for mergers or acquisitions, but for the visible foundation. The organization was his new life's work, dedicated to providing resources, legal aid, and housing for youth aging out of foster care. He had realized that the world was full of people like Sarah, brilliant, brave and resourceful individuals, who were forced to operate in the shadows, simply because the millionaires in the towers refused to look down. He was no longer interested in building higher walls. He was focused on building sturdier bridges. The sound of the elevator chimed, and Julian turned to see Sarah walking in. She wasn't wearing a black dress or a white apron. She wore a sharp professional suit in a deep emerald green, a heavy backpack slung over one shoulder. She was 6 weeks into her first semester at Columbia University, where she was studying criminal justice, with the same relentless focus she had used to document a murder plot. She looked taller, her posture no longer dictated by the need to be unobtrusive. "The board meeting is at 10, Julian," she said, checking her watch. A simple, elegant piece he had given her, not as a bribe, but as a colleague. "The scholarship committee has the first round of applicants ready for review. There's a girl from Queens, aged out last month, who wants to study forensic accounting. She reminds me of the version of me that used to hide in the laundry room." Julian smiled, a genuine expression that actually reached his eyes. "Then she's exactly who we're looking for, someone who knows how to find the things everyone else tries to hide." They walked out of the penthouse together, heading toward the car waiting downstairs. It wasn't a Porsche or an SUV with tinted windows. It was a modest, reliable sedan, driven by a man Julian now knew by name, whose kids' birthdays were marked on his personal calendar. As they stepped out into the afternoon sun, Julian paused for a moment, looking at the city around him. He saw the janitors, the couriers, the doormen, and the street sweepers. He saw the vibrant, complex humanity that kept the world spinning while the powerful took the credit. He remembered the grit of the driveway, and the yellow rubber glove that had saved his life. He realized that the worst day of his life had actually been the first day he started seeing clearly. He had lost a fortune in the divorce, and the subsequent scandal, and his reputation among the elite had been stained by the ugliness of Isabella's betrayal. But as he looked at Sarah, who was busy discussing the merits of the new foundation's legal clinic, he knew he had made the better trade. He had traded a fortress for a home, and a blindfold for a vision. Sometimes the person who saves your life is the one you never noticed, and sometimes the only way to truly see the world is to first be forced down into the dirt.